This is not going to be like your regular paper for 80 marks of 3 hours. It's going to be a 40 marks paper for 2 hours. Act of 2005. This is a very important act that was brought around in our country. This knowledge is very helpful and useful in terms of preventing the natural disaster. We need to understand how to prevent disaster. So that's why we have a topic and we have a syllabus. Good morning and welcome to the model question paper solving session of disaster management in the third semester BCom and B.B.A. This is a common paper and it's quite an interesting paper. The most important thing of this paper is that it's a 2-credit paper. So this paper is only for 40 marks. So that's a very important thing that we have to know. This is not going to be like your regular paper for 80 marks of 3 hours. It's going to be a 40 marks paper for 2 hours. So the probable sections that you would be able to see is a 10 marker and a 5 marker. You're not going to have 15 marks coming up here. So let's have a quite close look into what are the kinds of questions that you will be encountering in disaster management. Now let's start with the 10 markers, the probable 10 markers that have been asked in the previous year's question papers are this. Explain the role of disaster management in the modern world. Now this is very important. Why? Because when we talk about disaster management, we are trying to make ourselves understand about how to prevent a disaster rather than just writing about those disasters. So when you get this question, the question is more from the point of prevention rather than explaining the disaster. All of us know that yes, there is a disaster that has taken place and it is quite bound to happen because of the nature's fury. But our role as citizens of the country, we need to understand how to prevent disaster. So that's why we have a topic and we have a syllabus called as disaster management. So the role of disaster management in the modern world is to prevent disasters from happening, is to take a precautious manner, a note, so that we are able to prevent the disasters coming forward. Now, there are two things here which I would like to clarify. When you write this answer, of course, you are going to get a lot of free hand in terms of explaining this answer, explaining this question with a lot of examples. There are a lot of collective examples which have happened in India in the global level. So you can take those examples and write it about in the disaster management. Plus, you will also be able to tell in your answer script how the disaster management is important from affecting the economy, from affecting the lives of people, from affecting the regular operations that are going on in our day-to-day life altogether. So the role of disaster management should be more from a preventive method rather than just trying to get yourself in a panic mode altogether. So you need to bring in the role of disaster more from understanding the various causes, the various effects, how to educate people, how to train them, how to make them understand the effects of disaster, the impacts of disaster on the modern world. The next question is about the disaster risk reduction techniques. Now, when I say disaster risk reduction, which means to say that again, we are trying to reduce the risk of a disaster. Now, you might ask me, can disasters be completely prevented? The answer is no. Why? Because disaster is not in our hands. It is caused by a natural effect on the earth. So there might be a flood, there might be a volcano, there might be a landslide, or there might be an earthquake in any part of the world. That is nature's decision. But as a people, as the citizens, as a responsible people of the society, we need to understand and apply risk management techniques through which we can reduce the effects of disaster. Now, for example, there are certain techniques which are very, very important here, where we try to talk about the response, the mitigation, the preparedness, and all these main words, the main keywords have to be presented here at any given point. So whenever we talk about disaster reduction techniques, so we are talking about the preparation, the mitigation, the response, the how you are going to get yourself prepared for the situation, how you are going to mitigate the risk, how you are going to respond at the initial levels. You can probably cite the examples of what has happened in the state of Odisha last year, when they were already given the signal about that there is going to be a disaster, that is a cyclone effect which is going to affect the coastal villages of the state of Odisha. Automatically, the people responded very well by getting themselves prepared almost 3 to 4 days before the storm could hit the coastal areas. So the areas were given early warning, they were given the airborne warning, and they were also told to move to safety zones altogether. They were prepared in terms of food, the basic shelter, the clothing, and all those factors, so that they were able to reduce the impact of human life as well as the physical and economic factors altogether. So all these points will actually help you to write the answer called as disaster risk reduction technique. The disaster risk factor is very, very important. Why? Because you cannot carry forward things with disaster. You cannot always appreciate the factor that disaster can be controlled or disaster can be completely averted. Disaster can be only reduced. So the next time when there is going to be an earthquake, when there is going to be a flood, or when there is going to be a landslide, you know what are the effects of the disaster. So it becomes a responsibility of us to get the first-hand information, train the people, make them understand that yes, there are certain areas in our country, there are localities in our country which is already prone to disaster. That's the work of the nature, but it is our responsibility to prevent and save our lives from these disasters happening. So in this particular question, you can give out the real life examples. You can tell them how exactly you need to be prepared, how to mitigate, how to respond, and how to take the disaster cycle forward. The next one, explain the role of Panchayat and NGO. When I say the word NGO, it stands for non-governmental organizations. Now, the Panchayat and NGO are two important factors which I would like to discuss here. Why? Because Panchayat and NGOs are the basic foundation institutions who will take a primary role in educating people about disaster, in educating the system about how to prevent disasters happening. Many a times we find that disasters are something that is quite naturally happening and people have no clue about it. But let me tell you here, there are several NGOs and several Panchayat local bodies who have understood about the aftermath effects of disaster. They've also done a detailed study in terms of collecting the reports, analyzing the reports, understanding what are the real cost factors, how we can avoid the disaster. So all these functions can be done by this Panchayat and NGO as training classes or modules, so that the local people will now try to understand, will now try to calm down by the factor that whenever a disaster comes, we know how to handle it. Now, this becomes quite important for all of us here when we talk about the role of Panchayat. The leaders of the Panchayat, the village administrative officers or the camp officers who are available in the village level administration as well as in the non-governmental organization, the responsible people, the district leaders or the team leaders, they are the first-hand source of information towards in terms of dispelling the disaster away. They go to home, they go to different schools, they go to different institutions where they take classes on the weekend, they get training sessions and workshops in order to make the people believe and make the people even more enlightened about the factors of how disaster will happen and how you need to prevent it, how you need to mitigate the risk altogether. So in this, you can probably write your examples, you can bring in the real life example stories, or if you have been a part of any campaigns or social organizations, you can also write your experience here and you can tell how exactly a disaster can be averted in the given scenario or situations altogether. So definitely these kind of questions are quite interesting to write. I would request all of you not to get panicked, not to worry about too much that, sir, I have not studied. How should I expand the answer and write? What do I exactly need to write? Now, the factor here is that it is not about writing pages after pages. It is more about the quality of content which the people will be looking into. So I would always suggest the students that whenever you are writing the answer, write the meaningful version. Given more examples, relevant examples, and present the entire answer in a well-structured manner. Start with an introduction, then go to the main part of the answer where you have to define the concept, understand and analyze the concept, conclude the answer with an example, give them, a positive conclusion altogether so that your answer looks really well-mannered and planned. So automatically you will be able to score marks. And being a 40-mark paper, there's always a possibility and probability that you will be able to score a full mark in this paper, which will really help you to boost your results. Followed by, explain the Disaster Management Act of 2005. This is a very, very important act that was brought around in our country in the year 2005. Why? Because we understood that the concept of disaster management has to be addressed to the nation, and we as the people of this country need to have a rules, need to have a regulation, a setup through which we will be able to understand and we will be able to guide ourselves better in the coming years. So the National Disaster Force, the NDRF, the National Disaster Relief Force, was set up under the governance of the Prime Minister of India in the year 2005, and there are different NDRF teams with the State Disaster Relief Force which have been formed as a part of the structure. The main role of this team and its policies are more towards guiding people, helping the state and the center to overcome any kind of disaster that comes upon our country. Now, when we talk about this act, it is not something related to law altogether. It is more from a policy guideline. So the Disaster Management Act has been created in such a manner so that we are able to understand the difficulties that are faced by the people. We are able to understand the economic impacts, the physical impacts, as well as how the society and the culture gets completely into a chaotic role altogether. Now, you could probably take the example, the live example that's going on, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has taken the world by a complete surprise and left the world completely in a disaster position altogether. But how did various countries respond to the situation and bring back life into the economy is a very good story. It's a very good example for all of us to write in the examination. So you could probably bring out the example of our own country and bring out how the disaster has been mitigated, how the policies and guidelines have been helpful in terms of preparing us for the next level in disaster management. followed by the 5 markers. The 5 markers are going to be very, very simple because these are something which is going to be related to the day-to-day incidents like earthquake, flood, landslides, volcano, and the indigenous knowledge altogether. Now, let me just tell you what it is all about when I talk about the earthquake, flood, and landslides. Now, these are kind of factors which are quite prominent. Now, when you talk about flood, it doesn't mean that you're just going to describe about the flood in line and length. You're just going to talk about what is a flood, which is going to be the sudden rise in the levels of water, which causes an impact in terms of the day-to-day life. And this actually leads to a complete overflow of water from the sea into the land, and which completely erodes the agriculture, the roads, the land, everything. All these factors have to be mentioned in terms of your flood. Then followed by, when we are going to talk about the earthquake, earthquake is also a kind of a natural disaster where because of the movement of the earth's plate, there is a division, there is a crack on the surface of the earth, because of which the land, the buildings all fall down like a pack of cards. And this is a very, very serious effect where the loss of life is also on the higher side, and the loss of physical buildings and other assets also comes into position. Now, earthquake is always prone in those areas, in those zones where the seismic level, the land, the soil under the land is very loose. So automatically, a small jerk or a small movement on the tectonic plates of the earth would always cause an earthquake altogether. Then we talk about landslides and the factor. Landslides are also very, very important thing here. Why? Because there are many areas in India where you would see that because of a flash flood, because of an avalanche effect, because of a water flowing, all of a sudden a gush of water, the land, the top soil, the top surface just flows down away, washing away all the basic minerals, the plants, the animals, and whatever surface that's available, which causes a serious impact on the society, and that leads to a huge problem in terms of the living condition. Volcanoes are also a part of a very big natural disaster calamities altogether, but we don't find volcanoes too much in India. The volcanoes are distributed more towards the Java, Sumatra islands and the other parts of Japan, where you will see a sudden outburst of the lava coming out, which is going to spill over a lot of fire and particles. That's going to create a lot of pollution in the atmosphere. Plus, when the molten lava just flows down from the mountain, it goes and it just erodes away all the soil. It just pulls out all the life there. So you can explain about volcanoes or the landslide or any other factors using the common examples. You can mention the places where these kind of incidents have happened. That will be able to help you to score better marks in the examination. The last one is called as the indigenous knowledge altogether. When I talk about the indigenous knowledge or the indigenous knowledge, it is primarily about the intuitive knowledge that is being collected by our tribals, by the primary people living in that area. Now, this kind of knowledge is something which is very, very precious. This cannot be translated in a normal term. This cannot be told or written on the papers. It does not have a documentary evidence every time. But then this knowledge is very, very helpful and useful in terms of preventing the natural disaster. Now, for example, the fishermen community exactly know when the waves will start rippling against them and what could be the effect of tsunami coming in. Now, similarly, people living near the volcanic areas or people living near the earthquake-prone zones, they have got a lot of intricate knowledge which cannot be translated in English or any other language. But they can feel, they can sense what exactly happens during that scenario, and they just go forward and apply that knowledge so that they are able to overcome the entire factor. So the concept of indigenous knowledge is very, very important in terms of solving any disaster that comes forward. So this kind of knowledge needs to be shared, needs to be forwarded, and needs to be told to the people so that they are able to understand the effects and they are able to reduce the disasters that come in our day-to-day life. Now, with this, I would like to come to the end of today's session. I hope and believe that the session is of a great resource and help to you. I wish all the students writing the disaster management paper all the very best and try to score the maximum marks. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session. Have a great day.